everybody. Welcome to the Minds of Technology and Society meeting that we have every week with funding from the Glushko Foundation. Today's speaker is Professor Pete Richerson. Pete is Distinguished Professor Emeritus of Environmental Science and Policy at UC Davis, where he has been since the dawn of time. And Pete began his career as a linologist, a lake ecologist, but transitioned into the study of human cultural evolution and gene culture coevolution, and basically literally wrote the book on the subject with Rob Boyd. Hugely influential book, kind of field-defining work. We just had the first meeting of the Cultural Evolution Society in Jena, Germany this September. This is a field that is really sort of coming into being that unifies evolutionary biology, the social sciences, psychology, and basically anything that has to do with humans and the way they interact. I'm really, really excited to have Pete here, and let's all welcome Dr. Pete Richerson.
Thank you, Paul. So what I want to talk to you today about is human evolution in the Plio-Pleistocene, a world queerer than we supposed. So the idea behind this talk is that evolution is substantially driven by the environments that organisms find themselves in. And the Plio-Pleistocene environment was a really exciting place. And so I want to try to put together a story about how it influenced the evolution of humans. So the kind of big questions that we have in the evolution of the human capacity for cumulative culture, in other words, the thing that is a hallmark of humans is that we put together these complicated technologies and complicated social organizations and complicated artistic productions, all on the basis of skills that we learn from each other. That's more or less a definition of culture. And so some of these big questions are, why are humans a Pleistocene phenomenon? In other words, why didn't culture evolve long ago and far away? I mean, it's been a sort of a killer adaptation for us. We've become the world's dominant organisms on the back of the technology and social organization that we possess. And yet, it only happened very recently. And most killer adaptations, wings to fly with and internal skeletons and camera-style eyes and other kinds of eyes too, like compound eyes. These are all things that date back to the Paleozoic or the Mesozoic. So they did occur a long time ago. And humans have this surprising recency to them, it seems to me, and the phenomenon of culture, particularly this complex cumulative culture, is a phenomenon that has arisen, as far as we can tell, in the world only very recently. Then there's a further question. Humans didn't amount to much for most of the Pleistocene. We only began to do these, we did fancy-ish things in the middle Pleistocene, and we made stone tools in the lower Pleistocene, but it wasn't until the upper Pleistocene that we began to make things that look familiar to us today, fancy stone tools and fancy compound tools and famous artwork. All of that is in the last 50,000 years or so, a little earlier in Africa. So that's a kind of a big mystery. And then evolution picked up again. The pace of evolution seems to have picked up again with the origins of agriculture about 11,000 years ago. And then the origins of complex societies, that is to say societies with an advanced division of labor, the state kinds of political organizations, there's things that are like states. And then there was another technological explosion starting about 1,000 years ago. So there's an awful lot that's been telescoped into our quite recent history. And these questions require considerations of climate and climate variation, and more generally on the paleoecology of humans. What was driving this trajectory of increased complexity over the last couple of million years. So it isn't social learning itself. So you might think that social learning is something that only humans do, but that's far from correct. Social learning is common in nature. We all know about the Japanese macaques that learn to wash the sand off of potatoes and just spread it. And pine cone, there's a great pine cone opening story told by a guy named Turkle, Joseph Turkle, who found that in Israel, these black rats have turned themselves into squirrels, and they open pine cones, and this turns out to be something that if you put a starving black rat in a cage with pine cones, they don't get to first base with pine cones. This is something they have to learn as little pups from their mother. Some genius black rat presumably invented this technique, and the black rats in these Israeli pine plantations make a good living out of doing this, but it is a socially learned thing. And there are many, many other examples of that. This is the golden age of non-human animal social learning. There are great books and hundreds of papers on toothed whales and on primates and on corvid and citizen parrots and crow-like birds. I just picked up a paper. I was skimming the abstract last night. I fell asleep on it, but it was about social learning in bumblebees. So it's not even restricted to what we think of as the sort of brainier taxa in the animal world. It's all over the place. But human social learning seems to be really different. This is these Thai forest chimpanzees who have a marginally cumulative culture in the sense that they have a two-part technology. They lay down a stone or wooden anvil, and then they take a stone to crack palm nuts on the anvil. And so there's two parts to it. Maybe they were vetted separately. It takes a little, you can see the little guy there studying his mother's cracking technique. And over a period of some years, it takes the little chimp to eventually learn how to crack a nut. The blow has to be strong enough to crack the nut, but not so strong as to smash it flat. So there's a little bit of finesse involved. And it takes the youngsters quite a while to learn this. And so cumulative culture is built upon humans' ability to learn those kind of simple tricks much faster, so that you can get up to the current frontier in the technology in a reasonable amount of time, and then you're able to contribute to enlarging that or improving that technology. And that's the kind of thing we do. And this limited amount of this shows up very early. So these are Acheulean lower Paleolithic. It's a lower Paleolithic Acheulean hand axe. And these tools were extensively used. They seem to have been general purpose cutting tools. So they were used to shape wood, among other things. So the wooden artifacts that people use stone tools to manufacture are unfortunately very rare in the fossil record. But when they turn up, they're often quite amazing things. Wooden tip, fire hardened wooden tip spears, for example, that are fairly old. And then by the time we get to ethnographic hunter-gatherers and Stone Age people, they were making really fancy stuff like these harpoons and harpoon heads, lots of elements combined in the same tool. Things like compound bows and recurve bows that are kind of an engineering wonder. If you get a hold of the Bowyer's Bible and teach yourself a little bit about how these things are made, they're quite amazing pieces of engineering or craftsmanship, depending upon what your standards for engineering versus craftsmanship are. This is my nomination. Maybe other people have some other nomination as the most sophisticated Stone Age machines built. These are the Polynesian double-hulled voyaging canoes that the Polynesians used to get all over the Pacific, and well, they got all the way to Madagascar, going the other direction as well. So these were seaworthy boats that could sail the Pacific and the Indian Ocean for immense distances, and people could get back alive to tell their friends that there was new territory downwind, usually. So hard to beat this stuff until you get to the industrial age. This is at Bletchley Park, where all the spies that were breaking the German codes were centered. They built this machine toward the end of the war to break some more sophisticated German codes. This was called the Colossus, and it was built using telephone circuitry, telephone switching circuitry, but it's arguably the first general purpose computer. So this is ultimately the fruits of Neumann's and other people's imaginations. They built these machines. And we could do this because we have this cumulative culture that depends upon accurate imitation. So this is photos from an old study by Albert Bandura, the pioneer of child social learning experimentation. So he has a model torturing Bozo the doll. Most of you are too young to remember Bozo the doll, I imagine. But it was a common toy in the 50s and 60s, and Bozo had sand in the bottom, then you inflated him, and then he could be hit and he'd fall over and pop back up. And so in a more violent age, this was considered a fine toy for children. And so Bandura had these demonstrations of the model doing quite specific things, and then the kids sitting on the Bozo and pounding on him in the face, throwing him around, kicking him, and hitting him with a hammer. And then the kids display a pretty close facsimile of the model's behavior, just from observing a quick video of this thing. More recently, more sophisticated comparative studies have been, all sorts of sophisticated comparative and non-comparative work has been done on children's abilities to socially learn. This is just a glimpse at a study that Andy Whiten and his workers designed some time ago. They build what they call artificial fruit, stout plastic boxes that are closed with a latch, and inside they have, if the participants in the research are kids, there's candy in there. Chimpanzees are kind of fastidious about how they get their sweet stuff, and they don't care much for candy, but so for the chimpanzees, there's a piece of fruit in there that they would very much like to get their hands on. And then they receive a demonstration by usually a human demonstrator, and they demonstrate two ways of opening this latch. There are various kinds of latches. This one has got these sort of nylon bolts that hold the box closed, and the demonstrator demonstrates two ways of getting them open. One, pushing with their forefinger to push the rod out until you can get their fingers around it and pull it out, and that's what's being demonstrated here. The other one is a twist. So it was as if those bolts are threaded. They aren't, but the demonstrator twists and pulls to get it open. And then chimpanzees and young children are participants in these experiments. And so, and then they're videotaped, and independent coders then code them for whether they show a good imitation of a poke or a twist. And so in terms of pokes, the chimpanzees are almost at random. They have a pretty good imitation of a twist, but even young children are on average much better, and they get a little bit better with age. So even 2-year-olds, these are adult chimpanzees who've interacted with humans and been the subject of lots of experiments, so they're pretty comfortable with these kinds of tasks in general. But the chimpanzees want to get that box open, and they just go at it until they get it open, pretty much. And they're not, they don't seem to be highly motivated to imitate. The kids the opposite, and they usually, particularly the older kids, are near perfect imitators. So then, what this leads to in the evolution of technology is a sort of a descent with modification system. So what I'm going to illustrate it with here is the evolution of the mariner's compass. This same story can be applied to 1,000 different pieces of technology, and social organization isn't all that different. So the first thing that was discovered, Chinese geomancers, these people who go around and tell you where to put your building and how to site it, feng shui, isn't it called? So one of their instruments was a magnetite spoon that sat on a nearly frictionless surface, and it would indicate north and south. So that was part of their equipment. So it didn't have anything to do with mariners' compasses, but this principle was known. And so then the sailors innovated a simple compass in which you had magnetized needles that were tied to something that made them float on a little bowl of water. So then you could go out there and find out what the direction of north was fairly handily with that instrument. But it wasn't really good for steering by. So they invented a pin compass, and then when it got to Europe, the Europeans put this compass rose on the thing, and then they would fix the compass to the boat so that there was you can see a line up there at the top. That's the line that indicates the bow of the boat. So then you could turn on a heading. You can turn the boat and bring up the proper heading. If you want to go northeast, you turn the boat till the lubber's line is called lined up with northeast, and off you'd go. So you could actually steer a course by a compass. These compasses were kind of erratic, and there were a number of additional innovations that came to pass. One is that when the boat's motion, a simple pin compass, the boat's motion is sending the card whirling around all the time if there's very much boat motion. So this is a modern, it's after GPS, it's antiquated now, but this was a box compass that was made in the 20th century for boats. So you fixed it on the boat, the same way as the previous compass I described, but it's got gimbals on it so that as the boat's motion goes, the compass stays fairly flat. The boat's motion doesn't impart much motion to the card, and then it's filled with an alcohol or some viscous liquid that also damps the motion of the compass, and that was the sort of the high art of compass making. There's a lot more. This story can be elaborated quite considerably, but you get the idea. Over centuries, a millennium or so, the compass was vastly improved as an instrument of navigation. Now, this is a macroevolution. These problems I've been talking about are what go in evolutionary biology under the term macroevolution. So these are big evolutionary events that are outside of our ability to observe them directly. We can't experiment with macroevolution, at least not easily. We can do macroevolutionary experiments with E. coli in the laboratory, but most of the kinds of things that we're interested in human evolution, we can't do experiments. We have ratty observational data, and we try to infer the processes that generated that list of important transitions, if you want. And there are two flavors of theories that are applied to this. The internalist kind of theory argues that it's sort of rare triggers that push evolution through constraints. It just takes hundreds of millions of years to progress from a mammal-like dinosaur to humans. And every species in the world would have advanced cumulative culture, or at least many of them would, except it's just complicated to get the brain arranged and other things arranged to make it useful. And this is a common sort of explanation, often tacit. I mean, often people don't even know the word internalist, but they generate these kinds of onward and upward kind of stories. It's sort of, I think, a byproduct of the ethnocentrism or species centrism, would be a better word, of humans. The externalist explanations argue that evolutionary patterns are a response to selection in environments in the recent past. Species are being battered around by selective forces in a dynamic, changing environment, and they're just trying to track the environmental variation that's generating that selection. And I'm going to push this kind of externalist hypothesis today. I'm not going to say too much about some of the internalist alternatives, but because I think it's a neglected form of explanation, and more people need to know about the contrast in these two kinds of explanations. It is, and some of you thinking about it, both of these things are true. It's just exactly how they're mixed together that's really the critical thing. So evolution is never instantaneous, right? So there are always internal limits to the rate at which evolution can occur. So at least at short time scales, everybody's got to be an externalist. Everybody's got to be internalist. On the other hand, evolutionary change in response to major environmental changes is a real thing, documentable. So that's obviously an important kind of explanation too. And how we mix these two things together to get a proper, the best explanation we can get for some of these macroevolutionary events is where it's really at. But as I say, I'm going to be a little partisan today. So why are the human big brains and human cognitive culture a Pleistocene phenomenon? Can we get any leverage of this from comparative things? So only humans have this complex culture, but lots of animals have simpler culture. And so can we sort of piece together a comparative story that we believe in? What happened there? Okay, well, it's a new computer. It does things that surprise me sometimes. So Rob and I, in our 85 book that Paul mentioned, well, the book as a whole is an attempt to, at a adaptationist dissection of what culture, human culture might be good for. And one of the exercises in that book is we ran a sort of a contest, a simulation contest between two systems, a system with genes plus learning and a system with genes plus learning plus culture. In other words, you had information in the genes plus culture case, you had information from your own experience, that's the learning part, and you had information about what mom did. Okay? So you could take these two forms of information and combine them to decide what you think the world is like, a sort of a Bayesian approach to this problem. And so then we asked what kinds of environments would favor a costly system that included culture. So what we set up was 3 model worlds, and one of which had a modest amount of total environmental variation, 10 times more and 10 times more after that. And then we looked at the autocorrelation of this environment. So that for any given amount of variation, it might be concentrated in long, slow events or quasi-events, or it could be choppy day to day, or it could be in between. So the serial autocorrelation of the environment from one generation to the next, we use a generational time scale, is a measure of how the choppiness of the variation. And so then this is a contour, these are contour plots of so genes are favored here, culture is favored there, and then you can see right away that all the action is up in that top panel where there's a huge amount of environmental variation and a fair amount of autocorrelation. That hill up in the top left-hand corner of the top panel is the action. So let's dissect this thing. What am I? Okay. So there's a cliff at the top here because of the scale. That we'd have to expand the scale to. The environmental change is slow. Genes track it perfectly well, so you don't have to adapt to. You could adapt to things that happen slowly with genes. If there isn't much environmental variation, the total amount of variation is small. Well, there's a range in which culture is favored, but not very much. This is nearly flat. So the action is, again, all in that top figure. If environmental change is too fast, culture is useless because if you're imitating mom and mom's environment is outmoded, then there's no sense imitating mom. The only thing that you can really use to adapt to rapidly varying environments on the generational time scale is to use some form of individual learning, some kind of individual phenotypic flexibility. Mom's information is useless. So if the environmental variation is large, if the environmental autocorrelation is fairly high, and then culture is a big advantage, and the environmental variation can't be too fast or too slow. So, that's where it lay. It was a pretty theoretical kind of a calculation that was hard to test. But one consequence of this is that cultural evolution ought to be faster than genetic evolution. And so a few years ago, Charles Perrault did a comparison. These light gray boxes are estimates of rates of evolution from archaeological and paleoanthropological material. The dark dots are from a man named Gingerich's analysis of rates of biological evolution. It's a really fascinating story why this is downwardly sloping to the right and linear on a log-log scale, but I haven't got time to go into that. Evolution rates measured over short time intervals are much faster than ones measured over long time intervals, and culture has that same pattern as does biological evolution, genetic evolution. But you can see the fitted slopes there. Sometimes culture changes really slowly, but on average it changes quite a bit faster than genes do. And it converges with genes right up here on the sort of microbial evolution timescale. So, the cultural fads and fashions that change from year to year are sort of like the flu virus changing its antigenic properties from year to year. So humans evolve as fast as microbes at this short time scale. It's a kind of an interesting idea. So culture really does drive evolution faster, therefore potentially can track that middle scale environmental variation more efficiently. Now another part of the question here is, so it seems like it takes big brains to operate a fancy cultural system. So I want to assess the evidence for that and talk about the adaptive trade-offs. Let's start with the adaptive trade-offs. This is data from a classic paper by Leslie Ayo and I forget Wheeler's first name. And what they observed was that human brains take up a small proportion of our body mass, but a quite disproportionate portion of our basal metabolic rate. We're burning up a lot of calories to keep this thing turning over. And so just for comparison, average mammals have about a brain that takes up about 5% of their basal metabolism. And really, small brain mammals like the possums and things like that, they can get it down to around 1%. And those are selectively significant differences, right? Having a big brain has a lot of costly overhead. You better be doing something pretty good with that brain, or our selection is going to shrink it. So you might think of this as the dinosaurs had the right idea all along. I went to that museum in western Colorado with my son one time, and you see all these dinosaur skulls, great flanges that supported muscles and so on. And you ask, where's the brain case? Well, it's buried down there someplace. And you see an elephant skull. Elephants are much more brainy mammals, and they're like us. There's no mistaking where their brain is. That is a pretty appreciably sized organ. So something is going on here that has some animals are able to support a large brain. Climate change so environmental change it has the right sort of qualitative pattern to fit an evolutionary trend. So this is the mean temperature of the Earth over the last about 70 million years, from the late Cretaceous on through the whole Cenozoic. And so you can see climates have been, in a bumpy kind of way, have been getting cooler. Cooler also means drier, and cooler means that the poles cool relative to the equator, so it means more spatial heterogeneity, north to south. And what Zachos and his co-authors tried to do here was these dots represent what the geochemical record suggests is a variability. So the variability back in the Cretaceous and the early Cenozoic was modest, and the envelope of variation is increasing, and then at the very top there, the last couple of million years, the big ice ages. So a whole lot, there's been a pretty dramatic shift. And a lot of, I don't have time to go into it, but I could give you a whole mini lecture on the biotic events that have been driven by this trend. Now there's this very suggestive study by Richerson way back in 1963. So he took advantage of fossil brain casts to try to get a time series for how brains had evolved from the archaic, mainly, these are the mammals of the Cretaceous, the Paleogene, most of the first half of the Cenozoic, the Neogene is the second half of the Cenozoic, and recent is the Pleistocene. And what you can see here is that over that whole period, brains were, on average, getting bigger, according to Richerson's data, and the rate of increase so this represents 30 million years, that represents 30 million years, and that represents 2 million years. So the rate of increase went up sharply. Now this is old data. It hasn't been repeated as far as I know. I found a nice paper on brain size evolution in the toothed whales. But nowadays with computerized tomography, we should be able to get a much finer scale record. So you notice this is just divided into carnivores and ungulates. Primates don't even figure in his book because there are so few endocasts. So this is coarse as can be, but it has the right feel to fit that climate record. And here's the last 6 million years. You can see that the first stone tools appear. Well, they pushed them back a bit from the time I made this slide, but 2.5 million years ago, or a little bit more, 3 million maybe. And first the climate descended into this period that was dominated by a 41,000-year cycle, and then in the last million years or so, it's got this 100,000-year cycle. So the Pleistocene is clearly a moving target. There's no the Pleistocene. It's evolving. Now the trouble with this data is that one more thing. So this is some data that Simon Reeder and Kevin Leyland collected on innovation frequency and social learning frequency as observed in the primates in the wild. So there's a literature on this in the primatological literature. And then they just assembled all this in one data set. And they get a pretty executive brain ratio. I don't want to go into the complexities of what that is. It's basically brain size. And particularly of the brain, the executive part of the brain, which is supposed to be devoted to higher cognitive functions. And you can see there's a pretty good correlation. And it's interesting that individual innovations in social learning are both correlated. So Kevin derives from this sort of a general intelligence hypothesis. Big brains are good for everything that brains are good for. They're not terribly specialized. So that's some nice data. There's also some data on bird brain size that has the same flavor. Now the problem here with my story so far, and it's a serious problem I think, is that the long-term climate change record resolves only changes that are so slow that they shouldn't require any culture or individual learning. We're talking about changes on timescales of 20,000 years, 40,000 years, 100,000 years. Genetic change, range changes. There's a lot of ways to cope with that. It doesn't seem like things that are changing on a million-year timescale require much brains to cope with, to me at least. And then the scales kind of fell from our eyes. It was really exciting for Rob and I because we had this theory and no data to back it up. But ice core drilling on Greenland in the late 80s, raised cores that were then analyzed in the early 90s. And this is the kind of thing that they turned up. So this is the last 80,000 years. There were 2 cores drilled simultaneously, not too far apart, by 2 different consortia. And back as far as 80,000 years, they agreed quite well. And so there's all this rough, what they call millennial and submillennial scale variation. The last ice age climate was a really variable place on just those kind of timescales where Rob's and my theory suggested might really drive a costly capacity for culture. That's why this is the last 10,000 years, the Holocene. So we live in a very stable interglacial climate, even more stable than previous interglacials that some people think. So the interglacials and the glacials are extremely different. And exactly where the instability, such vast instability comes from is still debated, but the story, prominent story is that it's the North American glacier is unstable. It piles up and then calves catastrophically when the sill can't support the glaciers anymore. And they calve off a vast number of icebergs that float out into the North Atlantic melt and interrupt the meridional overturning circulation that makes the Northern Hemisphere fairly warm at fairly high latitude. So that's a prevailing theory. I'm not a geophysicist, so I'm strictly an amateur. I just try to figure out what they found out, and I have no independent contribution to those things. So now we're with the kind of environments that really could, it seems to me, drive big brains. This kind of thing translates into terrestrial records at the temperate zone too. Bettinger and I had a paper where one reviewer said, no, this is all just stuff that happens where nobody lives, but that's clearly not true. There's lots of records at lower latitudes now. So why did human become more sophisticated and successful only in the late Pleistocene? Why didn't this develop in the early Pleistocene? So let's start with just as stones and bones evidence to try to convince you that really was the pattern. So early hominid history for a long time, relatively small brain creatures. Most of the bigger brain Homo, the species that are put in our own genus, are basically after this 41,000 year dominance occurs, or just about the time it was started. So that makes you suspicious. And then over the last, the genus Homo itself has more or less gradually gotten a bit brainier and brainier over the last couple of million years. So that's a relatively staid pace for the brain size evolution. The tool traditions are kind of parallel. So we have simple Olduvon tools for the first million years or more, and then the Olduvon tools, the people who made that fancy hand axe that I showed at the beginning came along, and then there was the Mousterian Middle Stone Age technology. You can see that they're making much finer things, points that are really look like they're spear points. So they were pretty sophisticated stone knappers. And then in the Aurignacian, we got things like lots of bone tools and perforated pendants and beads and fancier stone tools, longer bladed stone tools, techniques to create long, sharp blades. And then we've got the artwork and all of that sort of thing. So uh, the sophistication is increasing over time. Now, why might that be? So, pressing this externalist idea, what if the ice ages have been getting more and more variable over that period of time? So, cores raised in the early 2000s and or late 1990s and published a few years later seem to show that there's a remarkable increase in the rate of high-frequency variation and abrupt variations from one of these ice ages to the other. And you can see that here, when human cultures got really sophisticated, the climate was really variable. So this is the last two glacial cycles from a same team of people, but from cores raised in different places. And so you can it's a little bit expanded, so you can see how rough the last glacial was and how it was rough enough in the second to last glaciation, but not so rough. So there's evidence that again that the Pleistocene is not the Pleistocene. The Pleistocene is a trajectory of increasingly variable climates during ice ages. And then the longest core we have right now is a core from Antarctic ice core that goes back 8 glacial cycles. And I don't know if you can see the red dots. These red dots are the original authors flagging of abrupt climate events, just like in the previous one. And you can see that they're stacking up. And again, the most variable one is in this record is also the last ice age. So now these are the kind of things that, according to the theory, could very well be pushing bigger brains, more variation. So if you put this on a plot, this is the sort of greenish bars here. So this is, and I put the 600 cc line here. That's if humans had the brains of chimpanzees or Australopithecines in a human-sized body, we'd have a brain size of about 600 cc's. And so you can see that there's a modest advance, and then we have no high-frequency data back here, a little tiny bit more on that. And this blue line is blue bars are the 8 cycle ice core from Antarctica, and then the Martrat 4-cycle core here. So there's, I didn't even bother to calculate the statistical significance of those. All that data is rough. The number of skulls that are found are few, and the cores every core is a little bit of its own thing. It'd be much nicer to have more data, but you could see the parallelism there, and I didn't think it warranted any formal statistics. It's a monotonic increase, more or less, in all of them. So it passes a first test. Now, there are new deep cores that are going to test that earlier part of the record. There's an integrated ocean drilling program that raised cores in 2011, back 1.5 million years. This is off the Iberian margin off the Atlantic margin of Iberia. And so they've got these cores and they're analyzing them. And so far, I looked at this a few weeks ago, there's only teaser data. I mean, these things you're trying to get high resolution data for a core that's 1.5 million years old, and you want at least millennial scale resolution. So this is an industrial scale lab analysis problem, and you're wanting to analyze a whole bunch of proxies. So this is big time stuff. And then there's another project that hominid sites in Plio-Pleistocene drilling project that's got data cores from 18 boreholes in 6 basins in East Africa, back 3.15 million years. And again, there's only teaser data so far that isn't definitive. So this hypothesis, story, speculation, whatever you want to call it, that I'm laying out today will get a pretty strong test in what these data look like. So, because from the brain size, we can sort of estimate how what the data should look like. I mean, the brain size is a kind of a paleo proxy, right? For if this theory is right for environmental change, we can sort of reverse the causal story. Now, another issue here is that one of the things that seems to be important in cumulative culture is the size of the populations that are doing the accumulating. There's some theory on this and some tests. And so if you have big populations, you've got a lot of people doing innovating, right? And then if you can spread those innovations around a big population, in other words, if the big population is well connected, then cumulative culture ought to work a lot better than if you've got tiny isolated populations who things might wink out, traditions might die out, and if you're not very well connected with your neighbors, it's going to be hard to get them back in from people who've retained them. So cumulative culture is going to be seriously handicapped by small, isolated populations. And this is, so geneticists can use living genes to estimate population sizes. It's a tricky and very technical business, but they get some population estimates that at least some of them believe in. So back here, more than 1 million years ago, we're talking about our ancestors were small-brained, mostly herbivorous, Australopithecine-like creatures, and they seem to have been tolerably common. And then as the transition to Homo seems to have, and larger-brained Homo, seems to have led to low populations, and then around in the Plio-Pleistocene, or excuse me, in the last glacial, populations may have gone up and then gone down at the last glacial maximum, and then they shoot off the charts after the Holocene begins. So, but we're talking about effective population sizes of 1 times 10 to the 4th. So, you know, 10,000 people. Now, effective population size, but you have to about double that for an actual head count of populations. And the estimates for this population nadir here are maybe as few as 1,000 women got through. This is based on mitochondrial DNA. This analysis here is based on autosomal DNA. So humans were, you know, we were an endangered species in the last glacial maximum or sometime back there. And we weren't doing any too well. We always think that once humans came along, we were the kings of the jungle, right? Kings of the desert or the savannah, but I don't know. I'm suspicious. Now this data is fraught, so don't try to take it to the bank. And we do know more confidently from mitochondrial DNA that this bottleneck was relieved about 50,000 years ago, and human populations all over the old world seem to have started to increase at an overall linear rate, not a spectacular rate, but so by the end of the last ice age, we were a lot more numerous than we were before, and each continent seems to have tell its own tale, and they make something in this paper of South Asia being South and Southeast Asia being an especially lively place in the last ice age. This is this same graph again. So we had big brain hominins first turning up in the record. Our species back there, they started to do things in Africa along in here, and then there's this explosion that occurs again right in this same time period when the Pleistocene climate got the most variable. And the Upper Paleolithic environment seems to, although it was cold and dry, was pretty productive of game. And it looks like the populations managed to be interconnected over wide areas. So this is Europe, and these famous Venus figurines, so-called, turn up very similar ones all over Western Eurasia, Europe, from the Urals to the Atlantic and from the ice margins to the Mediterranean. So this suggests to a lot of us that this was just one ethnic group. So even though they weren't very numerous, they had a lot of population interconnection. And the interconnectedness allowed them to make all that fancy gear and do the fancy paintings and things that we know about. So these people were doing something different, but why? So my speculation, calling it a hypothesis, is maybe a little highfalutin for what it is. So the question is, why was there no progress between about 200,000 years ago and 70,000 years ago? Why were early Homo chronically rare? This is sometimes called the sapien or Renfrew's paradox. Why didn't this big brain creatures do anything very interesting for a long time, or at least only marginally interesting? And so my idea is that there was too little millennial and submillennial scale fluctuation. Humans were in the top carnivore niche. Top carnivore niche is crowded. So in modern Africa, there's lions and cheetahs and leopards, wild dogs, spotted hyenas. In Eurasia, add most of those, the above, plus bears and wolves and tigers. And it turns out that one of my colleagues at Davis, Caro, has come to the conclusion that wild dogs and cheetah are both endangered because they can't compete with lions. So they have very low genetic diversity compared to other species. And humans share this characteristic with them. We have unusually low genetic diversity. Chimpanzees have much more genetic diversity than we have. And this is presumably owes to this bottleneck, or maybe chronically low populations in which we couldn't maintain much genetic diversity. And maybe we were like wild dogs and cheetahs. We were a sort of a fugitive species. We were running from the lions, and the other interference predators, and we had a lot of competition for this game from wild dogs and wolves and so on. So maybe we were just barely hanging in there by the skin of our teeth, and then when the climate got more variable, our cultural adaptations could track that environmental variation better than our competitors. So we got a leg up on our competitors when the environment got worse for them. It got worse for us too, but we could cope with the worseness a lot better than they could. And then just a few words. Rob and Bob Bettinger and I wrote a paper about the origins of agriculture. Why didn't agriculture get invented far back in history? People were already doing pretty fancy things. Everybody knows it. Every hunter-gatherer knows if you put seeds in the ground, they'll sprout. And so we argued that the climate got warmer, wetter, and much more stable. And if you talk to farmers, I talked to farmers in my former life, and some of my relatives are farmers. And the first thing they complain about is government. The second thing they complain about is weather. And so agriculture is a tolerably marginal business even today. And so we argued that it would take that stable climate to make agriculture a going concern. So that, it's a completely different kind of argument about climate driving human evolution. But that paper's got a lot of citations, and most of them are favorable. Not all of them. So this was our argument. I just gave it to you. And then agriculture was a basis for complex societies, and we also, agriculture led to subsistence evolution in general in the Holocene led to this vast adaptive radiation. We've got 7,000, people speak 7,000 languages, and practically every language is associated with differences in social organization and subsistence systems. And so we fit ourselves into practically every terrestrial and amphibious niche possible in the world. The only continent we didn't settle was Antarctica. So this is a pretty spectacular bit of evolution. But it took, this is my measure of the internalist part of the thing. It took us 10,000 years, a little more than 10,000 years to get from the terminal Pleistocene hunter-gatherers to the modern kinds of industrial societies we have. And and the environment was the same. So there's been this progressive trend, and it's just driven by the fact that we can only evolve these fancy things, like the mariner's compass. Took 1,000 years to get from a geomancer's spoon to a ship's box compass. So that is the internalist rate limitation. And but the longer time scale things, like the Pleistocene changes, are, I think, a product of external forces. So I hope to convince you that climate and climate variation played a large role in human evolution, or at least that it's something we have to know about and take into consideration when we're trying to understand these events. And they, for the most part, they haven't been taken into account. People talk about cognitive revolutions and genes for genius that arose, and I'm quite